911, where's your emergency? This is Hamilton with
I need an officer, whoever you guys got to send an ambulance to Scarborough Drive immediately.
Okay, what's going on there?
I just came home and my girlfriend and her mother, somebody hurt them and they're all over the house. I seen blood everywhere and I ran out and I'm up in the front yard now.
Okay, listen, calm
I need
down.
help. Please send help right now.
Okay, listen to me, calm down, okay? What's your name?
My name is Nick Nigro.
Okay, just stay on the phone with me, okay? Are you in the front?
Pregnant. I was supposed to come home to sleep with her.
In the moment, it sounds like somebody who's scared, somebody who's panicked, somebody who is desperate. And it's what I think many of us would expect to see and hear from someone who has just come home and found a crime scene.
When I got here, they were taking out the two bodies.
Prosecutors say a 21-year-old and her 48-year-old mother were found shot to death in separate bedrooms of this home on Scarborough Drive around 3 this morning. Authorities say they were both murdered, but won't comment on a possible motive.
Okay, what was the highest grade you completed in school?
Highest grade?
Yeah.
I think a B.
I mean, no. Did you complete high school?
No, I didn't.
I know you said you're unemployed. Are you doing anything to try to get money?
Little side jobs.
This is a 25-year-old grown adult who is still living in his parents' home, doesn't really have a job. He doesn't have a meaningful sense of purpose or routine. So what we see is this parasitic tendency, which is absolutely a marker of psychopathic behavior.
Nick, if you were to describe your relationship with Paula on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, what would you
Be an 11.
Be an 11?
That good, and I'm not even lying. It's that good. Every little thing, me and her, would like fall into place, man. Good. It's hard to meet somebody like that. Every little thing.
You're engaged
And we're supposed to get married, and
And then how about with her mother?
how long was her mother good?
On a scale of 1 to 10.
A 10,
10
no
being
problem.
When he says regardless, it makes me think regardless of what. He very easily uses the past tense. And that shows me a couple things. One, it shows that he's trying to put distance between the death of his girlfriend and his girlfriend's mom and potentially him doing it. But also, it's the fact that he killed them both is not affecting him such that he's having a hard time coming to terms that it's real.
Nigro is really putting on display this perfect relationship, giving detectives what he thinks they want. This is what we might call impression management. Nothing to see here. Everything was perfect.
What do you think happened tonight? Okay.
All I know is I seen a lot of blood, dude. A lot. Like, it wasn't funny. I didn't see any bodies or anything like that. I seen blood. Like, a lot. Way more than just a little cut on a finger or something. I seen a lot. Like, it was like this.
It looks, if it is Paula, she's deceased. Okay? And it looks like her mother is also deceased. We haven't positively identified him yet, but based on what you told us, if that's Paula and that's her mom, then that's who is in the residence, then they're both deceased. Right now, we're just trying to figure out what happened to them. Take a minute. You need a drink. Need a tissue? You want some napkins or something? Yeah. You sure? I'm gonna grab one for you. Tissue or anything. Cool.
That is not someone who's experiencing genuine sadness. He didn't have actual tears coming out. Psychopaths often replicate emotions. They'll try to say the right thing. They'll try to do what they think is the most logical action at a certain time to come off as normal.
What do you think happened?
I don't know. That's why this is all tripping me the hell out. I would have known if she had a problem. I'm the one she runs to with her problems. So how would I not know? I'm like her boyfriend. I'm her protector. That's what I don't. Maybe she was doing something behind my back that I don't even know about. Maybe she was caught up with the wrong people. Like, I don't know what the hell is going on right now. I gotta figure out what's going on, just like you guys gotta do.
He's first talking about her in this perfect relationship, idolized way. He switches positions that she must have been into something that I didn't know about. And what we also see is that Nigro is making this all about himself. I have to get to the bottom of this. I have to figure this out. I'm confused. It's now about his reaction, not two dead human beings.
Is there anybody she's ever talked about that she had fear of?
Off the top of my head, the only cat that could come to mind would be a cat named Fresh. Okay, he's the neighborhood coke dealer. He's about to, you guys got him on your radar already. He's about to be sentenced in less than a week. And he's going around and he's creating mayhem before he goes to jail. I got a weird call one night. They were on my phone and I heard metal clanking in my phone, and that was them taunting me with guns over the phone. They
And what do you believe that metal clanking to be? What do you believe that metal to be?
A shotgun. What he shot my girl in the head with tonight.
Why would Fresh do something like this?
I beat him for $600 worth of.
Okay, he fronted you. He fronted
me.
$600.
Yes.
It's a very common sign of someone who is lying, where they will change the narrative and then they'll try to sprinkle in parts of the truth. He's saying that I have this drug problem. So look there, and the drug problem is going to lead you to who did this. He has a whole red herring figured out. He has the whole story planned for how he wants this to go.
It comes down to the fact that I lost my fiance because I had a cocaine addiction, and I have to live with that for the rest of my life. That's more pain than you or anybody else could put me through. But I feel like I killed a beautiful little girl because I wanted to put something up my nose. So I gotta live with that now.
How do you believe, or
he killed her because he knew how much I loved her? He would have been better off killing me.
If Nigro isn't able to convince detectives that his version of events is the truth, he knows he's in trouble. They're going to be looking at him as a suspect. And he goes out of his way to continue to seem cooperative, to be concerned. But if we pay attention to his statements and his words, his concern and his cooperation is all focused on himself. There's very little engagement around how his girlfriend or fiance is, how her mother is. There's just an acceptance they're dead.
if I heard this and I was in Colombia, down in South America or Mexico, I would believe that maybe they would execute someone's family with a rip, you know, for ripping someone off. But here in the United States, this would be the first time ever I've heard of something like this. So I'm having a tough time believing it.
Well, if you guys don't believe me, then I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go from here.
You see an arrogance that's emerging. Somebody who thinks he's clearly smarter than the detectives, but detectives pull at the sweater string and then things start to come unraveled. Because individuals who are psychopathic and have an unhealthy level of narcissism or arrogance can't resist taking that bait.
He, like most psychopaths, often feel like they're the most clever person in the room. They often feel as though no one can trick them and they have this skill to get what they want out of the world by manipulating them and tricking them.
Tell me what you just said.
I said I had a good relationship.
Now, through the course of this, you've been using that past tense. People that have lost loved ones don't use the word had.
Nick, I without a doubt, unequivocally believe that you did this. And I think I told you, it's the important thing is to find out why you did it. That's the bottom line.
I'm going through pain right now. I lost my girl and I'm not demonstrating no
You cried fake tears in here.
Fake tears?
Fake. They put the gun in her mouth and pulled the trigger.
And you're a coward because you won't admit
I
it.
put a gun in her mouth and pulled the trigger.
Absolutely.
Pulled the trigger.
You can hear the escalation in his voice when he's emotional here. He's so upset that they did not buy his story. And I think there you can actually see genuine emotion coming out of him, but it's just not for the reason that you would expect.
That's exactly what I did, yeah. That's false, dude. I know. I love doing that to 100-pound girls. What do I even need a gun for a 100-pound girl for? Think about it, dude. Honestly.
You're getting angry right now.
I'm getting angry because I'm tired of just being questioned.
We can see the rage.
The rage. I have so much rage, dude. I'm dying. I know.
I hear him snapping. He's saying these statements that he's doing it mockingly, but it's an easier way to try to make it come across as truthful.
You just say you wanted to talk to me?
I was wondering when can I be released or go home, or what can I do?
In a little while. We're still talking to your family. We're still talking to your family. Okay? When we're done talking to your family, then you can go.
All right. Are they here?
Yeah.
Detectives have tried a bunch of different strategies, and they might just have finally hit on one that was motivating to him. And it's likely about Nigro saving face with his own parents and with his younger brother. They're going to turn their back on me. They're going to move on. And I know how I look to other people. So it's manipulative in its own right, and it's self-serving.
He seems genuinely surprised when they bring up his family. Really, you can see that in his behavior. As soon as he says that, he says, "What?" It probably stems from a lack of control that he wants to have with not only his own actions, but those of his family. It's less likely to me that he feels guilty about having his family involved, and more so that he's very angry that his attempts to control the whole situation is subverted.
Ain't nothing to do it. Well, it's my fiance, and then they make me go do this. They tell me I did it. That is messed up to do to a human being. Just lost my fiance last night. Then they just trapped me in this room. Fake tears, you told me it's fake, dude.
That moment when he looks straight at the camera and pauses, we realize that this is all an act. Maybe they're in the other room watching, and maybe they might believe him this time.
Interrogating my family. What the does my family have to do with my love life? Old lady, my dad, my brother, doing that on purpose.
He's very angry that his attempts to control the whole situation is subverted, and he's not able to keep his family out of this. So he has his back against the wall. He tries to change tack again.
Yeah. Can I talk to Detective? What's up?
I'm gonna give you what you want.
What's that?
I did it. All right? Charge me, arrest me now.
Well, how'd you do it? Why'd you do it?
Pain.
What kind of pain?
Pain that I wouldn't even want to describe to any of you guys or remorse. Just know I did it. I'm breaking, I'm stepping up to the plate like a man. Please get my family out of this. I don't want any of my family bothered by this. I'm giving you what you want. I'm giving you a confession. I'll write it on paper. You can get it on tape. You can arrest me and charge me now and take me to jail. Please, just please make it as easy on me as possible, because when it comes down to it, my mother and my brother are my world. Okay? Their world's gonna be turned upside down. Ain't nothing ever gonna be the same again.
Nigro's attitude is he's doing them a favor. I think it's still his attempt to try and stay in a position of power. He's trying to control the narrative. Part of the manipulation may be that he's hoping for leniency. He's hoping if he gives them what they want, they'll back out of throwing the book at him. But what he also wants is for his family to be pulled out of this.
Well, where's the gun?
You guys have it.
Who did you do first?
My mother.
Why?
Because I wanted her to hear it.
You wanted your girlfriend to hear it?
Yeah. She was a piece to me. She turned my life upside down. went over there with the intention to feel like I finally stood up for myself. I didn't have the necessarily intention to do that drastic, you know what I mean?
Did you think you were just going to go over there to scare him?
I didn't want to scare him. I wanted to punch her in her face, but I wound up doing it worse.
It really seems like he wanted to make it as agonizing as possible. He says the words, "I wanted to punch her in the face," but he also showed up with a shotgun. So he clearly had other intentions in mind. And he had a certain order that he wanted to do things in order to make it worse for her because of the way she treated him. And it really affected his ego. And he needed to follow up with that, and he needed to gain revenge.
It's clear from the way he talks about his rage that he feels emasculated. So this starts to move us away from impulsivity and more towards giving into the impulsive rage. The majority of us may have urges at times to hurt someone or have them feel pain, but we have enough internal regulation. Psychopaths don't have that regulator.
And what was going on in your mind?
Nothing. Blank. Literally. Like she wasn't even there. When the gun went off, it was like there was nothing in front of me. All I felt was the heat from the gun. Just such a small room, such a big gun in a small room.
Okay. And when you shot Mary Jane, how far away were you?
Decent distance, away from her bed.
Okay. Was she?
Say from the muzzle of the gun to her head was at least 15 feet.
Did you wake her up?
I just went in and she kind of like sat up, Mary Jane did. She kind of just like sat right into it. Kind of the same thing with Paula too.
She sat up a little bit?
A little bit. Pretty sure you guys found they both had this type of look on them.
He's talking about it almost like they're not real people, they're puppets. And that lack of emotion, that lack of connectedness to somebody that he was prepared to marry and live with really highlights that lack of emotional experience.
Okay, when you got out of Mary Jane's room, what did you say?
Oh, freaked out, coming towards her bedroom door.
Okay,
Like I said, I put the gun up like a bar so she couldn't get through, and I told her to sit down on the bed. Shut the up.
And did she comply?
Yes, sat right down. Didn't say a word, not even a peep.
Okay.
Like a little puppy. Didn't say one word when you tell me to shut up, you know?
Okay.
And then I just raised the gun, shot her and cycled and shot her again.
Why'd you shoot your girlfriend twice?
Couldn't take her anymore. Sad as that may sound, rather than just breaking up with her. She had a vendetta out for me anymore. She was out to get me. It was almost like a little battle in my head. It's either her first or me. Because if she got her chance to put me in that same position she did, that I did to her tonight, she would too. I'd be laying there just like she was.
He really has this mentality of it's me against the world. We see that a lot in psychopaths. He's really tried to make himself believe if I wouldn't have done this, she would have done it to me. I had to protect myself.
What was going? I mean, you said pain. What kind of pain? What are you going through?
I'll be honest, the actual night tonight, nothing even happened. This has been building up for the whole 2 years. Me and her got started on a bad note, and it ended on a real bad note. And what I did is 100% unjustifiable.
What happened? What's been building up?
You ever have a girl take you, and have you ever dated when you were younger, have a girl take you and crush you?
Yes.
Literally, like a soda can, and throw you in the corner like a rag doll.
Do you think she crushed you?
Yes. She kept playing me for a fool, like I was a little puppet on a string.
And
tonight was just, that was it. That was it. Wrong as it is, that tonight was it. It was a battle. Her family will say different, but her family and her from day one made me look like the black sheep. So I gave them what they want. Now I'm really a piece. I did her, broke them like between 2 and that 2:12 call. Okay.
You didn't go back into the house when you got back there the second time.
It's not like I'm some psycho. I want to stand over and think, like, yeah, look what I did. You know what I mean? Get my jollies off. It's not like that.
Nigro is telling us that he's not sadistic, and yet he's also told us that he deliberately chose to kill her mother first so that his girlfriend would be aware that her mother was being killed, which is nothing short of a sadistic act.
I created a monster because I was too nice to her in the beginning. My mom told me I was going to do it. She said, you don't cater to a woman like that and give them every little thing you want, because then they expect it. Then you create a monster and you got to deal with it.
Okay. And that's
what happened.
That's what happened.
I created a monster. In return, she made me a monster.
He really portrays himself as a victim of women when really he was the one victimizing women. I think that what we're all thinking when he's saying that is, he says, I created a monster. And the natural progression is, are you talking about a monster in you or in her?
This is a culmination of years of relationship, like over the course of the 2 years that you've been together.
Yeah.
This all just welled up.
As cold-blooded as that may sound, yeah. And I know I look like a piece in everybody's eyes in the world now. Probably even my own mother and my own brother. They're probably not even gonna never talk to me again. I'm just tired of all the pain, man. Tired of living how I've been living for God knows how many years. I don't want my family to suffer for this. I'm tired of people looking at me like a piece of There's nothing I can do. It's out of my hands now.
Nigro understands he tried to give a narrative that wasn't believed. He's accepting his fate. And because people are dispensable to him, he's projecting that onto his mother and brother. They're going to turn their back on me. I think at this point, what we're seeing is somebody who's accepting his reality.
The name Richard Cottingham was largely absent from the stories of the women whose lives ended violently across New York and New Jersey. Their cases existed separately: a missing teenager here, a murdered young woman there, an unidentified body in a hotel room, a cold case gathering dust in a police file. The connections were not immediately visible. There was no single suspect whose name appeared beside them all. No obvious pattern that investigators could recognize in real time. And behind that scattered collection of tragedies was a man who, on the surface, seemed to belong to an entirely different world. Richard Francis Cottingham was born on November 25, 1946, in the Bronx, New York, and grew up in the New York, New Jersey area. In 1966, he began working for an insurance company in a job involving computers. He married, had 3 children, and maintained the outward appearance of a stable family man with regular employment. Nothing about that public identity by itself revealed the scale of violence that would eventually be associated with his name. But according to the cases later linked to him, his criminal history stretched back decades before investigators understood what they were dealing with. The earliest case now associated with Cottingham dates to 1965. When 18-year-old Alice Jean Eberhardt, a nursing student in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, was murdered. Her death remained unresolved for generations. Only in January 2026, after investigators reopened the case in 2021 and continued interviewing Cottingham, did he confess responsibility for her killing. That confession pushed the beginning of his known murder timeline back to 1965, earlier than the 1967 date often associated with the beginning of his crimes. 2 years later, another young woman would disappear. On October 28, 1967, 29-year-old Nancy Schiava Vogel disappeared in Bergen County, New Jersey. Vogel was a mother and was reportedly on her way to play bingo at a church. Several days later, her body was found inside a car. The cause of death was strangulation. For decades, the case remained unsolved. There was no known serial killer attached to it, no name that investigators could place at the center of the crime. In 2010, however, Cottingham was connected to Vogel's murder. It was one of the first major revelations showing that the story of the so-called torso killer extended far beyond the murders for which he had originally been imprisoned. Another 1967 case, that of Mary and Della Sala, was also later linked to Cottingham. Like Vogel's case, it belonged to an era when investigators did not have the forensic databases and DNA technology available decades later. The significance of these older cases would only become clear as investigators began reopening them, one by one. In 1968, the pattern continued. Jacqueline "Jackie" Harp was only 13 years old when she was murdered in Bergen County. Cottingham was not arrested for her killing, and the case remained unresolved for many years. Decades later, he admitted responsibility, and in 2017, the investigation formally moved toward identifying him as the person responsible. The fact that Harp was only 13 made the case particularly tragic, but it also demonstrated something important about the broader pattern. The victims associated with Cottingham were not confined to one age group or one social background. They included adult women, teenagers, and very young girls. That same year, another case unfolded on Long Island. On December 15, 1968, 23-year-old Diane Cusick disappeared after leaving a dance class. She went to the area of Green Acres Mall in Valley Stream, Nassau County. Her body was later discovered, but the identity of her killer remained unknown for more than 50 years. The original investigation could not produce the answer. Then technology changed what investigators were able to see in evidence that had survived from 1968. Nassau County detectives revisited the case, and modern DNA testing eventually linked the evidence to Cottingham. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to Cusick's murder. It was a powerful example of how a case that had once seemed beyond resolution could be transformed by forensic science decades later. The evidence had not necessarily disappeared simply because the years had passed. Sometimes, it had been waiting for investigators to develop the ability to interpret it. In 1969, 2 more young victims would later be associated with Cottingham. Irene Blase, 18, was murdered in Bergen County. Denise Falaska, only 15, was also killed that year. Neither case was solved at the time. Cottingham eventually admitted responsibility for both. In 2017, the confessions involving Blase and Falaska, together with the Harp case, helped establish a much larger historical pattern. What had once appeared to be isolated murders were beginning to look like fragments of the same story. But the story was still incomplete. The geography was already becoming significant. Bergen County appeared repeatedly. Long Island appeared in the Cusick investigation. Later cases would extend the pattern farther into New York City and other parts of the metropolitan region. Yet during the 1960s, these jurisdictions did not have the modern systems of information sharing and forensic comparison that investigators could rely upon today. A murder in one county could remain separate from a disappearance in another. Evidence could remain in storage for decades without ever producing a usable connection. And a victim's case could become increasingly difficult to investigate as witnesses disappeared. Memories faded and records aged. There was another complication. Cottingham himself did not fit the image that people might instinctively associate with a serial killer. He had employment. He had a wife. He had 3 children. He belonged to ordinary society. At the same time, there were warning signs in his history that would later look very different when viewed in retrospect. He had been involved in incidents involving driving under the influence and theft. In 1973, he was arrested in New York in connection with allegations involving robbery, unlawful imprisonment, and sexual assault. In 1974, he was arrested again in a similar case. Neither incident resulted in a successful prosecution because the complainants did not continue participating in the proceedings. At the time, these episodes did not reveal to authorities that they were dealing with someone connected to a long-running series of murders. That knowledge would come much later. for the families of the women and girls already dead. However, the passage of time did not erase what had happened. A murder remained a murder whether it had been solved in a year, a decade, or half a century. And for investigators, the most difficult question was beginning to take shape. How many cases had been left behind by the same man? In the years that followed, the list would expand through old files, renewed investigations, forensic testing, and most significantly, statements made by Cottingham himself. But before those later revelations, there were still years of killings ahead. The cases of the late 1960s were only the beginning of a pattern that would continue into the 1970s, crossing county lines and eventually reaching the hotels of Manhattan and New Jersey. The man living an apparently ordinary life had not yet been identified. The investigators did not yet know his name, and the families waiting for answers did not yet know that, somewhere in the region, the person responsible was continuing to live among them. By the beginning of the 1970s, the pattern surrounding Richard Cottingham was becoming longer, wider, and more difficult to see. The murders were occurring in different places, involving different victims, and remaining inside separate investigative files. To the families who knew each woman, each disappearance or death was its own tragedy. To investigators at the time, there was no established reason to believe that the same offender was moving through the New York, New Jersey region. Only decades later would those separate cases begin to form a single timeline. In 1970, Lorraine Montalvo McGraw became another name associated with that timeline. McGraw was killed in Rockland County, New York. Her case remained unresolved for decades. One more cold case among many whose answers seemed increasingly distant as the years passed. It was not until 2022 that investigators formally connected her death to Cottingham. The significance of McGraw's case was not simply that another murder had been attributed to the same man. It was the geography. Cottingham's known activity was no longer limited to Bergen County, New Jersey. The investigation was beginning to reveal a broader reach across the metropolitan area surrounding New York City. Rockland County became another point on the map, separated from earlier cases by jurisdiction, but connected retrospectively through the same suspect. 2 years later, in 1972, 2 more women in Nassau County, New York, were later linked to Cottingham, Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy. Both cases had remained unsolved for decades. At the time of their deaths, investigators did not have the benefit of a modern DNA database capable of comparing biological evidence from one crime scene against another. There was no contemporary system that could instantly search thousands of records for a common offender. A case could remain trapped within the boundaries of the department investigating it. A name could be absent from one file even if it appeared in another. Evidence might exist, but its significance could remain invisible until technology or new information made a connection possible. The cases of Hines and Moy would eventually return to investigators' attention as part of a much larger examination of Cottingham's history. Their inclusion helped demonstrate that the geographic range of the suspected killings was becoming broader. Bergen County was no longer the only recurring location. Nassau County, on Long Island, was now part of the pattern. Then, in 1973, 2 additional women in Nassau County were linked to Cottingham, Sheila Hyman and Marita Rosado Nieves. Their cases added another layer to an increasingly disturbing timeline. The murders were separated by years, locations, and individual investigations, yet they were eventually brought together through the same suspect. Looking backward, the sequence is striking. The known cases had begun in the mid-1960s and continued into the early 1970s. There were victims in New Jersey and New York. Some were teenagers, others were adults. Some disappeared and were later found dead. Others were discovered after their deaths without an identified killer. And through all of it, Richard Cottingham continued to exist outside the awareness of the investigators who would eventually build the case against him. This is one of the central difficulties of understanding the Cottingham investigation. The full pattern was not visible while it was happening. It was assembled retrospectively. When investigators later reviewed the cases, they possessed information that detectives in the 1960s and early 1970s could not have possessed. They knew Cottingham's name. They knew that he had eventually been convicted of multiple murders. They knew that he had admitted responsibility for numerous older killings. They had access to forensic methods that had not existed when many of the original investigations were conducted. But none of that knowledge was available when the victims first disappeared. In the original investigations, detectives were dealing with individual human tragedies, often without knowing whether a missing person had been abducted, had left voluntarily, or had encountered someone dangerous. A murder scene might provide evidence, but evidence was only useful if investigators could interpret it and connect it to a suspect. In the decades before modern DNA databases, that connection was often extraordinarily difficult. The problem was compounded by geography. New York and New Jersey contain numerous law enforcement jurisdictions, and the cases associated with Cottingham eventually crossed several of them. A murder in Bergen County could be investigated by one department, while a disappearance in Nassau County belonged to another. A homicide in Rockland County could sit in a separate collection of records. Without a clear reason to suspect a common offender, the cases could remain isolated. This does not mean investigators simply ignored the crimes. The supplied history shows that many of these cases remained the subject of later review precisely because authorities continued searching for answers. But solving a cold case often depends upon information that becomes available only years later. A witness may remember something important. A forensic sample may become testable. A suspect may eventually make a statement. A file that once seemed unrelated may acquire new significance when placed beside another case. In Cottingham's history, all of these elements would eventually matter. His own criminal record also became more significant when viewed retrospectively. In 1973, he was arrested in New York over allegations involving robbery, unlawful imprisonment, and sexual assault. The following year, he was arrested again in connection with a similar incident. Neither case resulted in successful prosecution because the complainants did not continue with the proceedings. At the time, these incidents were not recognized as evidence of a serial murder investigation. There was no established connection between the allegations and the unresolved deaths of women across the region. Yet in retrospect, they form part of the documented history surrounding a man who would later be convicted of multiple murders. The distinction is important. Knowing what happened later can make earlier events appear obvious when they were not. Investigators working in the 1970s did not have the benefit of hindsight. They could not know that the man involved in those arrests would eventually become the subject of one of the largest cold case investigations associated with the New York, New Jersey region. By 1973, however, the timeline already contained a disturbing number of unresolved deaths. The victims had names, families, histories, and lives that existed independently of the man who would later be associated with their deaths. Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Marita Rosado Nieves were not simply entries in a future serial killer chronology. They were individual women whose cases remained unanswered for years. The later linkage to Cottingham would restore a degree of clarity to those investigations, but it could not restore the lives that had been taken, and the story was not yet approaching its end. If the cases of the 1960s and early 1970s revealed the breadth of Cottingham's activity, the next years would reveal another important element: the disappearance of two teenage girls in New Jersey in 1974. Lorraine Marie Kelly was 16. Marion Pryor was 17. On August 9, 1974, the two girls left their homes in North Bergen, New Jersey, intending to go toward the Paramus area. They never returned. Their disappearance would become one of the region's enduring cold cases. For their families, the uncertainty would last for decades. At the time, investigators could not establish that the girls had crossed paths with Cottingham. There was no known offender tying their disappearance to the other cases. The connection would come only much later, when Cottingham himself acknowledged responsibility. The case of Kelly and Pryor would eventually become one of the most significant examples of how far the investigation had to travel through time before the truth emerged. By then, Cottingham would already be imprisoned. The man responsible would no longer be free, but the questions surrounding his past would remain. And for the families of the missing girls, the difference between knowing nothing and finally knowing who was responsible would become one of the defining themes of the decades that followed. The murders of the 1960s and early 1970s had created a trail that nobody could yet see in full. In the years ahead, that trail would lead investigators toward Manhattan hotels, New Jersey motels, unidentified victims, and eventually the arrest that would end Cottingham's ability to continue killing. But in 1974, none of that had happened yet. 2 teenage girls had simply disappeared. Their families were waiting, and the man who would later be held responsible was still moving through ordinary life, largely invisible behind the identity he had built for himself. On August 9, 1974, 16-year-old Lorraine Marie Kelly and 17-year-old Mary and Pryor left their homes in North Bergen, New Jersey, intending to go toward the Paramus area. They never came home. At first, their disappearance was exactly that, disappearance. There was no immediate answer explaining where the girls had gone. No known connection to the other unsolved killings that would eventually become part of Richard Cottingham's history. And no reason for investigators to understand that the case belonged to a much larger pattern. For the families, however, the distinction between a disappearance and a murder offered little comfort. 2 young women were suddenly absent, and the uncertainty itself became part of the tragedy. The years passed without the answer their families needed. Decades later, Cottingham admitted that he had abducted and killed both girls. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to their murders, finally connecting the 1974 disappearance to the man already serving multiple life-altering prison sentences for other killings. The confession transformed the meaning of an old cold case. What had once been an unanswered disappearance became another piece of the larger history. Investigators were reconstructing around Cottingham. Yet the 1974 case was not the only unresolved murder in this period. In Manhattan, another woman's death would add a different kind of challenge to the investigation. On October 21, 1975, 26-year-old Rosalie Riceberg was found dead inside her apartment. The supplied case information describes signs of strangulation and an injury to her neck. At the time, there was no known connection between Riceberg's death and the murders in New Jersey. Her case entered the long history of unsolved homicides in New York City. More than 4 decades later, that history changed. In December 2024, Cottingham confessed to NYPD investigators that he was responsible for Riceberg's murder. Once again, a case that had remained unresolved since the 1970s was brought back into focus by information from the man who had already been imprisoned for other killings. But in the years between Riceberg's death and Cottingham's eventual arrest, the pattern continued. By 1977, the crimes associated with him had entered a new and particularly important phase, one that would eventually place hotels at the center of the investigation. On December 15, 1977, 26-year-old Marion Marzi Carr disappeared. Carr worked as an X-ray technician and lived in New Jersey. According to the case information, Cottingham abducted her and took her to the Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights. The following day, her body was discovered in an area near the hotel. She had been restrained and was killed by strangulation. The location would become significant because the Quality Inn was not merely the scene of a single tragedy. It would later appear again in the final months of Cottingham's known period of freedom. Carr's murder eventually became one of the cases for which Cottingham was convicted. In 1982, after his earlier conviction concerning Valerie Street, he was tried for Carr's killing and received another lengthy prison sentence. But in 1977, investigators did not have the perspective that would come later. They were investigating the death of one woman, not reconstructing the activities of a serial murderer who had allegedly been operating for years. The same year produced another case that would become closely associated with the identity later given to Cottingham: the murder of 17-year-old Gaylor Alexander. Alexander disappeared toward the end of 1977. Before the year was over, remains belonging to a young woman were discovered in Dumont, New Jersey. Some of those remains had been placed inside children's toy boxes that had been wrapped as Christmas presents. Later, the victim's head and one hand were discovered inside lockers near 42nd Street and 8th Avenue in Manhattan. Investigators eventually identified the victim as Gaylor Alexander. The circumstances of the case made it one of the most disturbing cold cases associated with Cottingham, particularly because of the deliberate efforts to separate and conceal the remains. According to the supplied data, NYPD cold case information records that Cottingham later admitted killing and dismembering Alexander. But the legal status of this case is more complicated than the cases for which he was originally convicted. That distinction matters. A confession can provide investigators with information that may otherwise remain inaccessible. But not every case connected to Cottingham carries exactly the same level of legal resolution. The responsible telling of this story, therefore, requires separating what was proven in court from what was later admitted or linked through investigation. The Alexander case also helps explain why the nickname Torso Killer became attached to Cottingham. The name came from the nature of some of the crimes associated with him, particularly cases in which victims were dismembered and identifying parts of their bodies were missing. It is a label that became widely associated with the case, but the victims themselves must remain at the center of the story. Gaylor Alexander was a 17-year-old girl whose life ended violently. Her identity was not simply an entry in a serial killer profile. For investigators, identifying her was an essential step toward giving her case a name and a history. For those who had known her, the discovery could not erase the years that had already passed. The pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore when viewed from the future. A teenage girl in 1974, a murdered woman in Manhattan in 1975, Marianne Carr in 1977, Gaylor Alexander later that same year. But this pattern was not visible to the people living through those years in the same way it is visible today. The information was fragmented. Different agencies investigated different crimes. Some victims disappeared without immediately being connected to homicide. Others were found under circumstances that made identification and investigation difficult. Modern forensic tools were not available, and Cottingham remained outside the center of those investigations. He continued to live a life that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. He had a job, a wife, and 3 children. That contrast would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of his history. The crimes were not being committed by someone who existed completely outside normal society. The man later convicted of multiple murders could return to an ordinary family environment while investigators were still trying to understand individual crimes. The year 1977, therefore, became an important bridge in the story. It connected the earlier cold cases to a period when the violence would become more concentrated around hotels, and when the surviving evidence would eventually help investigators understand the offender's methods. But there was still more to come. 2 years later, in December 1979, a fire at a Manhattan hotel would expose one of the most notorious scenes associated with the case. At the Travel and Motor Hotel, near Times Square, smoke was seen coming from room 417 during the night of December 1st to 2nd. Firefighters entered the room and discovered 2 women dead. One was eventually identified as 22-year-old Dita Godarzi, an Iranian immigrant who worked as a sex worker. The other became known simply as Manhattan Jane Doe because her identity was never established. Both women had been murdered and dismembered, and their heads and hands were missing. The inability to identify one of the victims added another layer of difficulty to an already complicated investigation. Dita Godarzi had a name, but the other woman did not. Both had lives that existed before that hotel room. Yet one of those lives could not even be restored to a name. The case would eventually become one of the crimes for which Cottingham was convicted in New York in 1984. But in December 1979, investigators were still facing the immediate problem of understanding what had happened inside room 417. The significance of the hotel would become clearer only after Cottingham's arrest. His connection to the Quality Inn, the hotel where Marion Carr had been killed, would become even more important in 1980. The locations were beginning to form another kind of pattern, places where victims could be isolated, where the crimes could occur away from the offender's ordinary life, and where investigators would later find evidence pointing toward the same man. Yet the most important turning point was still ahead. In May 1980, 2 women would be killed only days apart, and another woman would survive an attack inside the same New Jersey hotel associated with Carr's murder. That survivor would do something the earlier victims could not. She would cry for help. Hotel employees would hear her. Police would arrive. And on May 22, 1980, Richard Cottingham would finally be arrested. The arrest would stop the immediate threat, but it would not reveal the full history of what had already happened. For that, investigators would need decades more. The final months before Richard Cottingham's arrest brought the investigation into a period of concentrated violence. But even then, investigators could not yet see the full history behind the crimes. By 1980, Cottingham had allegedly been active for years, moving between New Jersey and New York and targeting women whose cases would later become part of a much larger investigation. The first of the 2 known 1980 victims was Valerie and Street, 19 years old. On May 5, 1980, Street's body was discovered inside the Quality Inn in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey. The location was significant because the same hotel had already appeared in the investigation into the death of Marion Marzi Carr in 1977. Street was found beneath a bed. She had been restrained and showed signs that she had been gagged. Investigators also recovered a fingerprint belonging to Cottingham on the mechanism of a pair of handcuffs left at the scene. That physical evidence would later become an important part of the case against him. But at the time, the investigation was still focused on the immediate crime. A 19-year-old woman was dead in a hotel room, and detectives had to determine who had killed her. The presence of Cottingham's fingerprint would eventually provide a direct physical connection. But the significance of that connection became much greater once investigators understood the history surrounding the hotel. The Quality Inn was no longer simply a location where a single homicide had occurred. It was becoming a place repeatedly associated with Cottingham's crimes. 10 days after Street's death, another woman was found dead in Manhattan. On May 15, 1980, 25-year-old Mary and Jean Giddini Rayner was discovered inside the Seville Hotel in Manhattan. Her case contained characteristics that investigators would later recognize as consistent with other Cottingham crimes. The victim was a young woman. The killing occurred inside a hotel, and the body showed evidence of severe violence and attempts to conceal or damage it. Cottingham was eventually prosecuted for Rayner's murder in New York and convicted in 1984. But in May 1980, the investigators dealing with these crimes did not yet know that the same man was responsible for the larger sequence. They were still operating within separate investigations, following the evidence available to them at the time. Then, 7 days after Rayner's death, the chain of events finally led directly to Cottingham himself. On May 22, 1980, he rented a room at the Quality Inn in Hasbrouck Heights. He brought a woman into the room. This time, however, the intended victim survived. Hotel employees heard her cries for help coming from the room. Police were called. When officers entered, they found Cottingham holding the woman. She had been restrained and injured. Cottingham was arrested at the scene. The importance of that moment cannot be overstated. Earlier investigations had begun with bodies, missing person reports, unidentified remains, or evidence left behind after the offender had already escaped. This time, police arrived while the suspected offender was still present, and the victim was alive. The woman could provide information. The room itself could be examined while the circumstances were still immediate. And the man investigators had arrested was no longer an abstract possibility somewhere in a case file. He was physically there. The arrest ended Cottingham's ability to continue operating freely, but it did not immediately reveal how many crimes were connected to him. Investigators began examining the evidence surrounding his activities, and the patterns became increasingly significant. Handcuffs appeared in the cases. Tape and restraints appeared in the evidence. There were similarities in the way victims had been restrained and attacked. Hotels repeatedly appeared in the timeline. And there was the connection between Cottingham and the Quality Inn, where both Marianne Carr and Valerie Street had been killed. The evidence did not exist in isolation. Each new piece gained meaning when placed beside another. A fingerprint that might have seemed important in one case became far more significant when investigators discovered another murder at the same hotel. A method of restraint could become meaningful when investigators found similar evidence elsewhere. A location could become a link between crimes that had previously been treated as unrelated. Yet it was the victims who remained at the center of the investigation. Cottingham's arrest did not undo the years of uncertainty experienced by their families. For some families, it would eventually provide answers. For others, the full truth would not emerge until decades later. The first criminal proceedings moved quickly compared with the later cold case investigations. In 1981, Cottingham was convicted in New Jersey for the murder of Valerie Street, along with other charges involving kidnapping and assault. He received a total sentence of 173 to 197 years in prison. The following year, he was prosecuted for the murder of Marianne Carr and received another lengthy sentence. By then, the legal system had effectively ensured that Cottingham would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the New Jersey cases were only part of the story. In 1984, Cottingham faced another trial in New York involving 3 deaths: Dita Godarzi, the unidentified woman known as Manhattan Jane Doe, and Mary and Jean Gadini Rayner. He was convicted in all 3 cases. The convictions established a legal record of multiple murders, but they did not establish the full number of women Cottingham may have killed. That distinction would become crucial in the decades that followed. The cases for which Cottingham had been convicted represented only the crimes prosecutors could successfully bring before a court. They did not necessarily represent every crime investigators would later connect to him. After the 1984 convictions, Cottingham remained imprisoned, but the investigation into his past did not truly end. Instead, it entered a much slower phase. Old cases remained unresolved. Families continued to live with unanswered questions. Police departments retained files from murders and disappearances that had never reached a definitive conclusion. Over time, technology changed. DNA testing developed dramatically. Old biological evidence could be examined using techniques unavailable when the crimes occurred. Records could be compared more efficiently. Cold case investigators could return to cases that had once seemed impossible to solve. And Cottingham himself became a source of information. This would make the later history of the case very different from its beginning. In the 1960s and 1970s, investigators had been trying to identify an unknown killer. After 1980, they had a known convicted murderer sitting in prison. The question changed from who did this to what else did he do? That second question would prove extraordinarily difficult to answer. Cottingham began acknowledging responsibility for older killings, sometimes decades after the crimes occurred. In 2010, he admitted responsibility for Nancy Schiava Vogel's 1967 murder. Later, investigators connected him to other cases, including Irene Blase, Denise Falaska, and Jacqueline Harp. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Lorraine Kelly and Mary and Pryor, the 2 teenage girls who disappeared in 1974. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to Diane Cusick's murder after DNA evidence had linked him to the case. He also acknowledged responsibility for additional Long Island murders, including Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Marita Rosado Nieves. These developments transformed the understanding of Cottingham's criminal history. The man arrested in a hotel room in May 1980 had already been convicted of several murders. But investigators were discovering that his known history stretched backward far beyond the crimes that had originally placed him in prison. The revelations also demonstrated why the full scale of the case had remained hidden for so long. Many of the victims had died before modern forensic systems existed. Their cases have been separated by jurisdiction and time. Some victims were unidentified. Others had simply become cold cases after every available lead failed. Cottingham's arrest had stopped the immediate danger, but it did not automatically solve the past. The past had to be reconstructed piece by piece. That reconstruction would continue for decades. And as investigators returned to old files, one fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. The story of Richard Cottingham was not ending with his convictions. It was expanding. Every new confession, every forensic connection, and every reopened case raised the same unsettling possibility. The crimes for which he had already been sentenced might represent only a fraction of the women whose lives had intersected with his. The next stage of the investigation would therefore depend not on catching a killer, but on determining how many unresolved deaths could finally be brought into the light. The arrest of Richard Cottingham on May 22, 1980, had brought an end to his freedom, but it did not bring an immediate end to the questions surrounding his past. When investigators first placed him under arrest at the Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights, they had a man in custody, a surviving victim, and evidence that could be examined. They could build criminal cases around the murders that were already known. What they could not yet know was how many other women had disappeared or been killed before that night, and how many unresolved cases might eventually lead back to the same person. The first convictions established a devastating but limited picture. Cottingham was convicted in New Jersey in connection with Valerie Ann Street and later Marianne Marzi Carr. In New York, he was convicted in 1984 for the murders of Dita Godarzi, the unidentified Manhattan Jane Doe, and Mary and Jean Ghidini Rayner. These cases created a legal foundation for keeping him in prison for the rest of his life. Yet the legal record was not the same thing as the complete history of his crimes. The difference would become increasingly important as investigators returned to older cases. For decades, the unresolved murders remained in police files, many of them originating in the 1960s and 1970s. By the time Cottingham's name began appearing in those investigations, the original crime scenes were long gone, memories had faded, and some evidence had survived only because investigators had preserved it. But modern forensic science created opportunities that had not existed when those crimes occurred. DNA testing became one of the most important tools in the renewed investigations. The case of Diane Cusick demonstrated how powerful that change could be. Cusick disappeared on December 15, 1968, after leaving a dance class and visiting the area around Green Acres Mall in Valley Stream, Nassau County. Her murder remained unresolved for more than 50 years. In 2021, Nassau County investigators reopened the case and examined evidence preserved from the original investigation. Modern DNA analysis ultimately produced a match to Cottingham. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to Cusick's murder. The significance of the case extended beyond one conviction. It demonstrated that evidence collected in 1968 could still matter more than half a century later. Technology had changed, but the physical evidence had remained. A sample that could not identify a killer in 1968 could become decisive decades afterward. It was a reminder that the passage of time does not always destroy a forensic trail. Sometimes, the trail simply waits for investigators to acquire the tools needed to follow it. Other investigations depended more heavily on Cottingham's own statements. In 2010, he admitted responsibility for the murder of Nancy Schiava Vogel, who had been killed in Bergen County in 1967. Vogel's case had been unsolved for decades. Her death had originally been investigated as an individual homicide, with no known connection to the other murders that would later be associated with Cottingham. His admission changed that. It placed a convicted serial murderer directly into a case that had previously remained unresolved. The same process occurred with other New Jersey cases from the late 1960s. Cottingham eventually admitted responsibility for Irene Blase, 18, and Denise Falaska, 15, both murdered in 1969. He also acknowledged killing Jacqueline Jackie Harp, who was only 13 when she was murdered in Bergen County in 1968. In 2017, these cases were formally linked to him through his confessions and the renewed investigative work surrounding them. For investigators, the admissions provided a rare opportunity to revisit crimes that had once appeared to have no path forward. For the families, the significance was more personal. The passage of decades had not eliminated the loss. It had only lengthened the period during which the truth was unknown. In the case of Lorraine Kelly and Marion Pryor, that period lasted almost half a century. On August 9, 1974, the 16-year-old Kelly and 17-year-old Pryor left their homes in North Bergen, New Jersey, intending to go toward Paramus. They never returned. Their disappearance became a cold case that remained unresolved for decades. There was no immediate explanation of what had happened to them, and no connection to Cottingham that investigators could establish at the time. Then, in 2021, Cottingham admitted that he had abducted and killed both girls and pleaded guilty to their murders. The confession gave investigators the answer that had been missing since 1974. It also demonstrated how different the investigation had become from the one conducted when the girls first disappeared. In 1974, detectives were searching for missing teenagers. Nearly 50 years later, they were questioning an imprisoned murderer who could provide information about the fate of those teenagers. The investigation was no longer simply a search for an unknown offender. It had become an effort to reconstruct a historical record. That reconstruction expanded again in 2022, when Cottingham accepted responsibility for additional murders in Nassau County. Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy, whose cases dated to 1972, were linked to him. Sheila Hyman and Marita Rosado Nieves, whose cases dated to 1973, were also included. These cases widened the known geographic range of Cottingham's activity and reinforced the pattern that had begun to emerge from the earlier investigations. The crimes were not confined to a single neighborhood or county. They stretched through the New York metropolitan area, from New Jersey into New York City and Long Island. Another important case was that of Lorraine Montalvo McGraw, murdered in Rockland County in 1970. Her case was linked to Cottingham in 2022. Again, the significance lay not only in identifying a killer, but in restoring a connection that had been absent from the investigation for decades. Each case added another point to the timeline and another victim to the historical record. In 2024, the investigation reached back again into Manhattan's past. Rosalie Riceberg, 26, had been found dead in her apartment on October 21, 1975. Her case had remained unresolved for nearly half a century. According to the supplied case information, Cottingham confessed to NYPD investigators in December 2024. That confession once again showed the unusual nature of the Cottingham investigation. Many serial killer cases begin with the arrest and end when prosecutors prove the known murders. Cottingham's case moved in the opposite direction. His imprisonment became the starting point for an expanding investigation into crimes that had occurred before his arrest. Each confession forced investigators to look backward. Each newly identified case raised the possibility that another unresolved homicide might also belong to the same offender. But this process also required caution. Cottingham claimed that he had killed far more women than investigators have been able to establish. He reportedly gave figures ranging as high as 80 to 100 victims. Those numbers are not equivalent to confirmed victims. They remain in proven statements by the offender himself. The distinction is essential because a cold case investigation must separate what can be independently supported from what is merely claimed. By the beginning of 2026, an investigative list identified 20 victims who had been established or linked to Cottingham, spanning from Alice Jean Eberhard in 1965 to Mary and Jean Ghedini Rayner in 1980. But even that number requires careful interpretation. Some cases resulted in convictions. Others were resolved through guilty pleas. Others were connected through confessions or investigative findings without carrying the same legal status as the original convictions. The difference between convicted, confessed, and linked is not a technical footnote. It is central to understanding the truth of the case. A courtroom verdict establishes one level of proof. A confession provides another kind of information, especially when it contains details known only to investigators or the offender. A forensic match can provide an independent connection, and an investigative linkage may remain subject to further legal or evidentiary development. Cottingham's story contains all of these categories, which is why the total number of victims cannot responsibly be reduced to a single dramatic figure. The most striking development came in January 2026, when investigators announced that Cottingham had confessed to the 1965 murder of Alice Jean Eberhard, an 18-year-old nursing student in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. The case had been reopened in 2021. After further interviews, Cottingham provided a confession and information that had not previously been public. That revelation pushed the beginning of his known murder history back to 1965. For years, 1967 had often been used as the earliest point associated with his murders. Eberhard's case changed that chronology. It also demonstrated that the investigation was still capable of producing new information more than 40 years after Cottingham's arrest. The past was not finished speaking. The cases continued to emerge from old files, preserved evidence, and conversations with the man who had been responsible for so much suffering. By 2026, the story of Richard Cottingham had therefore become something more complicated than the story of a killer who was arrested in 1980 and convicted in the following years. It had become a decades-long effort to identify victims, restore names to cold cases, test evidence that had survived for generations, and distinguish proven facts from the offender's own claims. The investigation had moved far beyond the original courtroom cases, and as each additional victim was identified or linked, one question remained unresolved. If 20 women could now be connected to Cottingham, how many other cold cases might still be waiting for an answer? The question of how Richard Cottingham remained unidentified for so long is one of the most difficult parts of his history. But it is also a question that requires caution. It is easy, from the perspective of decades later, to look backward and imagine that the connection should have been obvious. The timeline now appears to form a continuous sequence. Women and girls murdered across New Jersey and New York, repeated appearances of similar circumstances, hotel locations, restraints, and eventually a single offender whose own confessions would connect many of the cases. But investigators living through the 1960s and 1970s did not possess that completed timeline. They were working with individual victims, individual crime scenes, and evidence that often could not be compared across jurisdictions. The modern image of a connected database of criminal records and DNA profiles simply did not exist. That difference in investigative technology is central to understanding the case. Cottingham lived in a region where multiple law enforcement agencies operated across neighboring jurisdictions. A case in Bergen County belonged to one investigative environment. A homicide in Nassau County belonged to another. A murder in Manhattan could be handled by an entirely different set of detectives and records. Rockland County introduced another jurisdiction. When the cases were first investigated, there was no established reason to believe that all of these crimes were connected to one offender. Without that connection, investigators had little reason to compare every piece of evidence from one case with evidence from another. The fragmentation of information did not mean that investigators lacked dedication. It meant that the structure of the investigations made a wider pattern much harder to see. Many of the cases also involved victims whose deaths or disappearances presented different investigative circumstances. Some women disappeared before their bodies were discovered. Some victims were found dead, but could not immediately be connected to a known suspect. In the case of Gaylor Alexander, parts of the victim were found in different locations, creating an especially difficult identification process. In the case of Manhattan Jane Doe, the victim was never identified. When investigators do not know a victim's identity, even basic steps in reconstructing a person's final days become more difficult. A missing person's family cannot be contacted if investigators do not know who the person was. Records cannot easily be matched. Previous relationships, employment, travel, and other information may remain inaccessible. The unidentified victim becomes known only by the circumstances of her death. That is why the identification of victims is such an important part of the later Cottingham investigation. Restoring a name to a person is not merely a statistical improvement in a case file. It changes the investigation from an anonymous homicide into the story of an individual human being. Dita Godarzi was identified. Manhattan Jane Doe was not. Gaylor Alexander was eventually identified. These distinctions remained important even after Cottingham was convicted. The same problem existed with the victims whose cases remained cold for decades. A murder investigation can lose momentum when all immediate leads have been exhausted. Witness memories change with time. People move away. Records can become difficult to access. The original investigators may retire or die. The passage of time can make a case appear increasingly remote. But modern cold case investigations have demonstrated that time can also create new opportunities. DNA technology is perhaps the clearest example. The Diane Cusick case shows how preserved evidence can become more valuable as forensic methods improve. In 1968, investigators could not use modern DNA comparison to identify Cottingham. More than 50 years later, Nassau County detectives revisited the evidence and obtained a match. The result was not based simply on a historical theory. It was a modern forensic connection that could be used to support the case. Cottingham subsequently pleaded guilty to Cusick's murder in 2022. Other cases developed through a different mechanism: Cottingham's own admissions. Beginning with Nancy Schiava Vogel in 2010, his statements became a significant source of information for investigators. Later admissions connected him to Irene Blase, Denise Falaska, Jacqueline Harp, Lorraine Kelly, Marion Pryor, and other victims. The unusual aspect of this process was that investigators were not attempting to extract a confession from a suspect who was still denying involvement in a known crime. They were interviewing a convicted murderer who had already been imprisoned for decades and was acknowledging responsibility for crimes that had never been attributed to him. These admissions opened investigative doors that had remained closed for generations. But they also created a responsibility to verify what could be verified. A serial killer's claims cannot automatically be treated as facts simply because they are dramatic or because the speaker is already known to have committed multiple murders. Cottingham himself claimed that he had killed 80 to 100 women. That figure has never been established. Investigators must therefore distinguish between confirmed or linked victims and unverified claims. The current investigative picture, as provided in the case data, identifies 20 victims connected to Cottingham between 1965 and 1980. That number is substantial, but it is not equivalent to his much larger self-reported figure. The distinction protects the integrity of the victim's stories as well as the accuracy of the historical record. Another reason Cottingham's crimes were difficult to identify as one series was the contrast between his private behavior and his public identity. He worked for an insurance company in a computer-related position. He had a wife and 3 children. He did not live as an obvious outsider. There was no public identity that immediately announced criminal violence. That apparent normality would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case because it demonstrated how easily a person can conceal a private pattern of behavior behind an ordinary social role. Yet the documented incidents from his earlier life show that there were warning signs. He had been arrested for driving under the influence and theft. In 1973, he was arrested in New York over allegations involving robbery, unlawful imprisonment, and sexual assault. In 1974, another similar arrest followed. Neither resulted in successful prosecution because the complainants did not continue participating in the proceedings. These incidents did not reveal the full extent of his later history, but they show that Cottingham had already come into contact with the criminal justice system before his murder convictions. The failures of those earlier cases also illustrate another difficulty. A warning sign is not the same thing as proof of murder. Investigators could not simply infer from an unsuccessful assault case that Cottingham was responsible for unrelated homicides. Each crime required its own evidence. The later investigation, therefore, had to proceed carefully, separating what was known from what was suspected. Geography remained another crucial factor. The cases eventually stretched from Bergen County to Rockland County, Nassau County, Manhattan, and other areas of the New York, New Jersey metropolitan region. That range made the overall pattern harder to recognize at the time, particularly when the victims were not all found under identical circumstances. But once investigators knew Cottingham's name, geography became an investigative tool rather than merely an obstacle. Old cases could be searched for locations, dates, victims, and evidence that might overlap with his known history. Hotels became especially important because several of the cases involved them. The Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights was associated with Marianne Carr in 1977 and Valerie Street in 1980. The Travel and Motor Hotel near Times Square was the scene of the murders of Dita Godarzi and Manhattan Jane Doe in 1979. The Seville Hotel was where Jean Rayner was found dead in 1980. These locations did not automatically prove that every nearby homicide was connected, but they became significant pieces of the broader pattern once Cottingham had been identified and convicted. The hotel cases also reveal why the evidence surrounding Cottingham's crimes could be so difficult to reconstruct. Hotels are temporary spaces. People enter and leave. Guests may use false names or provide limited information. A room may contain evidence of a crime, but investigators must determine which traces belong to the victim, which belong to the offender, and which belong to innocent people who were present before or afterward. In the case of Valerie Street, a fingerprint belonging to Cottingham was found on the mechanism of a pair of handcuffs left at the scene. That physical evidence became particularly important because it connected him directly to the room and the restraints. When investigators later examined his broader history, the significance of the hotel pattern became clearer. But perhaps the most important lesson from the case is that the investigation did not succeed because of one extraordinary breakthrough alone. It developed over time through different forms of evidence, physical evidence, forensic testing, old records, renewed interviews, confessions, and the comparison of cases that had once seemed unrelated. Some victims were connected through DNA. Others were connected through Cottingham's admissions. Some cases resulted in convictions or guilty pleas, while others remained more complicated in legal terms. The investigation, therefore, became a long process of assembling fragments. By 2026, investigators had identified or linked 20 victims, but the possibility remained that other cases could still be unresolved. The story had changed from the search for an unknown killer into the reconstruction of a hidden history. And that reconstruction raised a difficult question that no database, confession, or forensic test could answer by itself. How many women whose cases remain unsolved were victims of someone whose name was never written in their files? For the families who had waited decades, the search was not about creating a larger number. It was about finding the truth for one person at a time. By the time the later cold case investigations began connecting Richard Cottingham to older murders, the courtroom record had already established that he was a multiple murderer. But the legal history of the case was more complicated than a single trial or a single verdict. Cottingham's imprisonment began with the crimes that investigators could prove in the early 1980s, while the much larger history of suspected killings emerged gradually over the decades that followed. That distinction is essential to understanding both the convictions and the later investigations. The first major New Jersey proceedings centered on Valerie Ann Street and Mary Ann Marzie Carr. Street had been found dead at the Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights on May 5, 1980. Investigators had a significant piece of physical evidence. Cottingham's fingerprint was found on the mechanism of a pair of handcuffs left at the scene. He was convicted in connection with Street's murder in 1981, along with other charges involving kidnapping and assault, and received a sentence totaling 173 to 197 years in prison. The following year, he was tried for the murder of Carr, who had been abducted and taken to the same Quality Inn in 1977. Carr's body was found the next day near the hotel, and the investigation determined that she had been restrained and strangled. Cottingham was convicted of her murder in 1982 and received another lengthy sentence. By this point, the criminal justice system had effectively ensured that he would never return to ordinary life. But the New Jersey convictions did not answer every question surrounding the crimes associated with him. The investigation then moved to New York, where prosecutors pursued the murders of Dita Godarzi, Manhattan Jane Doe, and Jean Rayner. Godarzi and the unidentified woman had been killed at the Travel and Motor Hotel near Times Square during the night of December 1st to 2nd, 1979. Firefighters responding to smoke from room 417 discovered the two bodies. Godarzi was eventually identified as a 22-year-old Iranian immigrant who worked as a sex worker. The second victim remained unidentified and became known as Manhattan Jane Doe. Both had been murdered and dismembered, and their heads and hands were never recovered. Jean Rayner, 25, was found dead at the Seville Hotel in Manhattan on May 15, 1980. Her case shared important characteristics with the other hotel killings associated with Cottingham. In 1984, Cottingham was convicted in New York of murdering Godarzi, Manhattan Jane Doe, and Rayner. Those convictions created another permanent record of his responsibility for multiple killings. Yet even after the New York proceedings, the number of known victims remained much smaller than the number that would eventually emerge from later investigations. The legal system had dealt with the cases that could be brought before the courts. Investigators still had an enormous number of unanswered questions. The most important change came when old cases began to be reopened. In 2010, Cottingham admitted responsibility for the 1967 murder of Nancy Schiava Vogel. Her death had occurred years before the murders for which he had originally been convicted. The confession effectively moved the known beginning of his murder history farther into the past. It also demonstrated that the crimes already proven in court were not necessarily the beginning of his activity. Other admissions followed. Cottingham was eventually connected to the murders of Irene Blase, Denise Falaska, and Jacqueline Jackie Harp. Blase was 18, Falaska was 15, and Harp was only 13. Their cases dated from 1968 and 1969 and had remained unresolved for decades. By 2017, Cottingham had acknowledged responsibility for these killings, giving investigators information that allowed the old cases to be connected to him. The revelations were especially significant because they showed that the pattern extended back to the late 1960s, when the man who would eventually become known as the Torso Killer had not yet been identified as a serial murderer. The investigation then moved into another group of long unsolved cases. Lorraine Kelly, 16, and Marion Pryor, 17, disappeared in North Bergen on August 9, 1974. Their families had waited almost half a century for an explanation. In 2021, Cottingham admitted that he had abducted and killed both girls and pleaded guilty to their murders. The legal resolution could not restore what had been lost, but it provided something that had been absent since 1974, a definitive account of responsibility from the man who said he had committed the crime. Around the same period, investigators were also making progress through forensic evidence. Diane Cusick had disappeared in December 1968 after leaving a dance class and visiting the area around Green Acres Mall and Valley Stream. Her body was eventually found, but the case remained unsolved for more than 50 years. Nassau County investigators reopened the case and examined evidence that had been preserved from the original investigation. Modern DNA testing produced a match to Cottingham. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to Cusick's murder. The Cusick case was especially important because the connection did not depend solely on an old confession. It demonstrated the continuing value of physical evidence preserved from a crime committed in an era when DNA profiling was not available to investigators. A sample collected in 1968 could become meaningful more than 50 years later because forensic technology had advanced. The same period brought additional admissions involving Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy, whose cases dated to 1972, and Sheila Hyman and Marita Rosado Nieves, whose cases dated to 1973. Lorraine Montalvo McGraw, murdered in Rockland County in 1970, was also linked to Cottingham in 2022. Each case expanded the geographic and chronological picture. Instead of a killer associated primarily with a handful of New Jersey and Manhattan murders in the late 1970s, investigators were now confronting a history stretching across multiple counties and back into the 1960s. The process continued into 2024. Rosalie Riceberg had been found dead in her Manhattan apartment on October 21, 1975. According to the case information, Cottingham confessed to NYPD investigators in December 2024. Again, a case that had remained unresolved for nearly 50 years was brought into the larger investigation. These later developments also illustrate why the word confirmed must be used carefully. Some cases resulted in convictions. Others were resolved through guilty pleas. Still others were connected through Cottingham's admissions or investigative findings without carrying exactly the same legal status. A confession is important evidence, but it is not identical to a jury verdict. A DNA match provides independent forensic support, but the legal resolution of a case can involve additional steps. The distinction matters because Cottingham himself made extraordinary claims about the number of people he had killed. He reportedly said that he had murdered 80 to 100 women. There is no evidence establishing that number as fact. The investigative record provided here identifies 20 victims who had been established or linked to him by the beginning of 2026, with cases ranging from Alice Jean Eberhardt in 1965 through Jean Rayner in 1980. That figure should not be confused with Cottingham's larger self-reported total. The difference between the two numbers represents one of the most important boundaries in telling his story responsibly. The victims who can be independently connected to him deserve certainty, while unverified claims must remain identified as such. Then, in January 2026, another major development pushed the timeline back even further. Cottingham confessed to the murder of Alice Jean Eberhardt, an 18-year-old nursing student in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. Her death had occurred in 1965, 2 years before Nancy Vogel's murder and several years before many of the other cases that had previously defined his known history. The case had been reopened in 2021, and after further interviews, Cottingham provided a confession along with information that had not previously been public. The revelation changed the chronology of the investigation. For years, 1967 had often been treated as the earliest point in Cottingham's known murder history. Eberhardt's case moved that starting point back to 1965. It was another example of how the investigation continued to evolve more than 4 decades after Cottingham's arrest. The legal story, therefore, is not a simple progression from crime to arrest to conviction. It is a series of stages separated by years and sometimes decades. First came the crimes for which Cottingham was prosecuted in the early 1980s. Then came the New York convictions in 1984. After that came a long period in which older cases remained unresolved, beginning in 2010 and accelerating in later years. Investigators returned to those cases with new forensic methods, new interviews, preserved evidence, and admissions from Cottingham himself. Each development added another piece to the historical record. But even by 2026, the investigation could not responsibly claim to have answered every question. 20 victims had been identified or linked. Cottingham had claimed many more. Some cases had been proven in court. Others had been resolved through later admissions or investigative connections. The result was a record that was substantial but still incomplete. And perhaps that incompleteness is one of the most important lessons of the case. A conviction can close a criminal proceeding, but it does not necessarily close every investigation. For the families of victims whose names were attached to Cottingham only decades later, justice arrived in a form very different from the one they might once have imagined. There was no return to the moment before the disappearance, no opportunity to prevent what had happened. There was only the gradual restoration of facts, a name, a date, a location, a forensic connection, a confession, and finally the acknowledgement that a death once surrounded by uncertainty had an identified perpetrator. The story of Richard Cottingham, therefore, remains not only a record of the crimes for which he was convicted, but also a record of the long effort to recover the truth about women and girls whose cases had waited for answers. The story of Richard Cottingham does not end with the final courtroom conviction, because the most consequential part of the investigation continued long after he had been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. For the families of the victims, the passage of time had created a particular kind of suffering. A murder leaves a permanent absence, but an unsolved murder adds uncertainty to that absence. For decades, families could know that someone they loved was gone without knowing exactly what had happened, who was responsible, or whether the person responsible would ever be identified. In Cottingham's case, some families waited not merely years but generations before receiving answers. The later investigation therefore became an effort not simply to establish the criminal history of one offender, but to restore individual identities to people whose deaths had remained unresolved. One of the clearest examples is Nancy Schiava Vogel. She was 29 when she disappeared in Bergen County on October 28, 1967. She was a mother and was reportedly on her way to play bingo at a church. Her body was later found inside a car, and her cause of death was strangulation. For decades, the case remained unsolved. In 2010, Cottingham admitted responsibility for her death. The admission did not change the facts of Vogel's life or restore the years that her family had spent without an answer, but it changed the historical record. Her death could finally be placed within a known sequence of crimes. The same was true for Diane Cusick, whose case demonstrated the other major force behind the later investigation, forensic science. Cusick was 23 when she disappeared after leaving a dance class in December 1968. She went to the area around Green Acres Mall in Valley Stream, Nassau County. Her body was found afterward, but the case remained unresolved for more than 50 years. In the 21st century, Nassau County investigators reopened the file and examined evidence preserved from the original investigation. Modern DNA testing eventually linked Cottingham to the crime. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to Cusick's murder. The significance of this case reaches beyond Cottingham himself. It demonstrates why cold cases cannot always be judged by the standards of the moment when they were first investigated. Evidence that seemed limited in 1968 could acquire new meaning decades later. A forensic method that did not exist when Cusick was killed could eventually provide the connection that investigators had been unable to establish. Time had not erased every trace. Instead, some evidence remained waiting for technology to catch up with it. The same pattern appeared in the cases of Irene Blase, Denise Falaska, and Jacqueline Jackie Harp. Blase was 18. Falaska was 15. Harp was only 13. Their murders occurred in the late 1960s, when Cottingham was still able to move through ordinary life without being identified as a serial killer. Decades later, his admissions brought their cases into the same investigative history. For families, the significance was not simply that another name had been added to a list. Each name represented an individual life interrupted. Harp, in particular, reminds us how young some of the victims were. The term serial killer can reduce a complex history into a label. But the victims were not statistics. They were daughters, mothers, students, workers, and young women with lives that existed before their final encounters with Cottingham. The later investigation could not restore those lives, but it could restore their place in the historical record. Lorraine Kelly and Mary Ann Pryor provide another example of the consequences of a case remaining unresolved. Kelly was 16 and Pryor was 17 when they disappeared from North Bergen on August 9, 1974. Their families had no immediate explanation for what had happened to them. Nearly half a century passed before Cottingham admitted that he had abducted and killed both girls. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to their murders. The time between the crime and its resolution is difficult to comprehend. A teenager can disappear in one moment, but the uncertainty left behind can continue through decades of family history. Birthdays pass. Generations grow older. People who originally searched for answers may die before they ever receive them. A later confession cannot erase that experience. It can only provide a truth that should have been known much earlier. The investigation also revealed how geography had contributed to the difficulty of recognizing the larger pattern. Cottingham's known victims were connected to different parts of the New York and New Jersey metropolitan area. Bergen County, Rockland County, Nassau County, Manhattan, and other locations appear across the timeline. The separation between jurisdictions meant that investigators in one place might not have known the full significance of a crime occurring somewhere else. In an era before modern information sharing systems and widespread DNA databases, a pattern that appears obvious decades later could remain invisible to the people investigating the individual cases. This does not mean that the failures were simple or that every unsolved case could have been prevented by better communication. It means that investigators were operating within the limitations of their time. The same caution applies when considering Cottingham's ordinary public life. He worked for an insurance company in a computer-related role. He had a wife and 3 children. On the surface, his life did not resemble the image that society often imagines when thinking about a serial killer. There was no obvious public identity separating him from everyone around him. That contrast became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It demonstrated that a person capable of extreme violence could maintain an outwardly conventional existence at the same time. Yet his earlier encounters with the justice system also provide an important warning. Cottingham had been arrested for driving under the influence and theft. In 1973, he was arrested in New York over allegations involving robbery, unlawful imprisonment, and sexual assault. In 1974, another similar arrest occurred. Neither case resulted in successful prosecution because the complainants did not continue participating in the proceedings. Looking backward, those incidents appear significant, but they cannot be treated as proof that authorities should have known the entire future. The connection becomes visible only after the later crimes and convictions are known. That is one of the central difficulties of historical hindsight. Once the ending is known, earlier events can appear to have been obvious warnings. At the time, however, each incident had to be evaluated according to the evidence available. Cottingham's case also raises difficult questions about the use of offender confessions. His admissions have helped investigators resolve numerous cases, but his claim that he killed 80 to 100 women remains unproven. That distinction matters because sensational numbers can overshadow the victims whose cases are actually established. By early 2026, 20 victims had been identified or linked to Cottingham in the investigative record provided. That is already an enormous number of lives. There is no need to inflate it with claims that cannot be independently established. In fact, the uncertainty itself is part of the truth of the case. Investigators must continue to distinguish between what Cottingham says, what forensic evidence demonstrates, what investigators can corroborate, and what courts have legally established. The 2026 confession involving Alice Jean Eberhardt illustrates how much of the story can still change. Eberhardt was 18 and a nursing student when she was killed in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, in 1965. Her case had been reopened in 2021, and Cottingham later confessed, providing information that had not previously been public. Her case moved the earliest known point in Cottingham's murder history back to 1965. That does not automatically prove that every unsolved homicide from that era was his work. It does, however, demonstrate that the investigation remains capable of uncovering new information more than 4 decades after his arrest. In the end, the most important consequence of the Cottingham investigation may be found in the names rather than the numbers. Nancy Vogel, Diane Cusick, Irene Blase, Denise Falaska, Jacqueline Harp, Lorraine Kelly, Mary N. Pryor, Rosalie Reisberg, Alice Eberhardt, and the other women whose cases have been connected to him. Each name represents a life that existed independently of the person who ultimately ended it. The phrase torso killer may describe the crimes that made Cottingham infamous, but it does not describe the people he killed. They deserve to be remembered as individuals, not merely as entries in a serial killer timeline. Cottingham's story also demonstrates why cold case investigations matter. A case does not become meaningless because decades have passed. Evidence can survive. Technology can improve. Investigators can return to forgotten files. Witnesses can come forward. And an offender already serving a sentence can provide information that changes what is known about the past. None of these developments can undo the violence, but they can answer questions that families have carried for decades. They can correct the record. They can transform unknown into a name and unsolved into an established history. Richard Cottingham was arrested because, on May 22, 1980, a woman survived and cried for help. That moment stopped the immediate threat. But the larger investigation continued for more than 40 years afterward. It moved through courtrooms, police files, forensic laboratories, interviews, confessions, and the memories of families who had refused to let unanswered questions disappear. By 2026, 20 victims had been identified or linked to Cottingham, while his much larger claims remained unproven. The story therefore closes not with a definitive number, but with a responsibility to separate fact from speculation, to recognize the limits of the evidence, and above all, to remember that behind every cold case file was a person whose life mattered long before their name appeared in an investigation. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Cottingham case. The passage of time can delay justice, but it does not necessarily erase the possibility of truth. By the beginning of 2026, the investigation into Richard Cottingham had reached a point that would have been difficult to imagine on the night of his arrest in May 1980. More than 4 decades had passed since police entered the Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights and found a woman alive, restrained and calling for help. That moment had stopped Cottingham's immediate freedom. It had led to arrests, trials, convictions, and sentences that ensured he would remain imprisoned. But it had not revealed the full history of what he had done. The deeper story emerged slowly, one case at a time, as investigators returned to murders that had remained unresolved for decades. What began as a handful of known crimes became a much larger reconstruction of a hidden history, stretching from 1965 through 1980. The number of victims that could be identified or linked to Cottingham eventually reached 20. Yet even that number must be understood carefully, because the legal and evidentiary status of those cases was not identical. Some were established through convictions. Others were resolved through guilty pleas. Some were connected through Cottingham's own admissions, while others involved forensic evidence, such as the DNA connection in the Diane Cusick case. And beyond all of them remained Cottingham's own claim that he had killed 80 to 100 women, a figure that has never been independently established. That distinction is important because the history of a crime should not be built around the most sensational number available. It should be built around what can actually be demonstrated. The confirmed and linked victims already represent an enormous human toll. There is no need to enlarge it with claims that cannot be proven. The victims themselves should remain at the center of the story. Nancy Schiava Vogel was 29 when she disappeared in 1967. She was a mother, reportedly on her way to play bingo at a church. Her body was found inside a car, and she had been strangled. For decades, her family had no definitive answer about who had taken her life. In 2010, Cottingham admitted responsibility. The confession transformed an unresolved homicide into part of a larger pattern. Diane Cusick was 23 when she disappeared after leaving a dance class in 1968. Her case remained unsolved for more than 50 years until investigators returned to preserved evidence, and modern DNA testing linked Cottingham to the murder. In 2022, he pleaded guilty. Irene Blase was 18. Denise Velasco was 15. Jacqueline Jackie Harp was only 13. Their murders in the late 1960s remained unresolved until Cottingham's later admissions connected him to them. The dates and circumstances were different, but the effect on the families was similar. Decades of uncertainty followed by a late answer. Lorraine Kelly and Marion Pryor were 16 and 17 when they disappeared in 1974. Their families waited almost half a century before Cottingham admitted that he had abducted and killed them. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to both murders. The legal resolution arrived long after the girls should have been able to grow into adulthood. But the truth about their disappearance could finally be recorded. Rosalie Riceberg was 26 when she was found dead in her Manhattan apartment in 1975. According to the supplied case information, Cottingham confessed to her murder in December 2024. Again, an old case was brought into the light through an investigation conducted decades after the original crime. And in January 2026 came one of the most significant developments of all. Cottingham confessed to killing Alice Jean Eberhardt, an 18-year-old nursing student who had been murdered in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, in 1965. Her case had been reopened in 2021, and after further interviews, Cottingham provided a confession along with information that had not previously been public. Eberhardt's case changed the earliest known point in Cottingham's murder history. For years, 1967 had often been treated as the beginning of the known sequence. Now, 1965 became the earliest year associated with a confession that had been added to the investigative record. Her case also illustrated something fundamental about cold case investigations. They do not always move in a straight line. A case can remain silent for decades and then suddenly produce new information because technology has advanced, because investigators revisit old records, or because a person already in custody decides to speak. The Cottingham investigation used all of these possibilities. It also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. The Diane Cusick case is perhaps the clearest example. The original investigators could not have known what DNA technology would eventually become capable of doing. Yet evidence from the crime survived long enough to be tested again. The resulting DNA match provided a connection that could not have been established in 1968. The lesson extends beyond one victim. Every cold case contains the possibility that evidence once considered limited may acquire new value in the future. But evidence is only one part of the story. The investigation also depended on human persistence. Detectives returned to cases that had been inactive for years. Families continued to seek answers. Old files were examined again. Cottingham was interviewed repeatedly. The process required patience because the passage of time had created obstacles that could not simply be removed. The people who had originally investigated the cases were no longer necessarily available. Memories had faded. The original circumstances had become part of history. Yet the cases remained important because the people who had died had not become less deserving of answers simply because time had passed. That principle may be one of the most meaningful legacies of the investigation. A cold case is not a case without value. It is a case waiting for circumstances to change. Cottingham's own life also complicates the public understanding of serial murder. He was not living as a fugitive or as an openly violent criminal. He had a job connected to computer operations at an insurance company. He had a wife and 3 children. He maintained an outwardly ordinary existence while, according to the cases eventually linked to him, committing murders over many years. That contrast is disturbing precisely because it challenges the assumption that extreme violence must always be visible from the outside. At the same time, his history included earlier arrests involving theft, driving under the influence, and allegations of robbery, unlawful imprisonment, and sexual assault. Those incidents were warning signs, but they did not reveal the full scale of the crimes that would later be attributed to him. Looking backward, the pieces seem connected. At the time, investigators did not have the complete picture. That distinction matters because hindsight can make uncertainty appear simpler than it really was. The case also illustrates the importance of separating criminal responsibility from speculation. About motive and scale. Cottingham became known as the torso killer because of the dismemberment associated with some of his murders, particularly the 1979 killings of Dita Godarzi and Manhattan Jane Doe. He later said that he removed heads and hands to make identification more difficult. But even here, investigators must distinguish between what he said and what can be independently established. His explanation provides insight into his stated method, but it does not justify assuming that every unidentified victim from the period was his victim. The same caution applies to his claim of 80 to 100 murders. The investigative record supplied here identifies 20 victims connected or linked to him. That is the number that can be responsibly discussed within the boundaries of the available evidence. Beyond that, there remains uncertainty. And uncertainty is not failure. In a true crime narrative, admitting what cannot be proven is part of telling the truth. The story of Richard Cottingham ultimately belongs as much to the victims as it does to the offender. The name of the killer became famous, but the women and girls whose lives were taken should not disappear behind that name. They had identities before they became case numbers. They had families, relationships, work, hopes, and ordinary routines. Some were teenagers. Some were mothers. Some were young adults. Some were identified only after decades. One victim, Manhattan Jane Doe, remained unidentified in the supplied record. Her absence is a reminder that even after an offender is known, not every question necessarily has an answer. A case can be solved in one dimension while remaining unresolved in another. A killer can be identified while a victim's name remains unknown. A murder can be confessed to while the full circumstances remain uncertain. A group of cases can be linked while the total number of victims remains impossible to determine. These distinctions make the Cottingham investigation difficult, but they also make it important. It demonstrates that justice is not always a single event. Sometimes it is a process that continues for decades. The arrest in 1980 was one moment. The convictions of the early 1980s were another. The New York convictions in 1984 added more. The later confessions beginning in 2010 reopened older chapters. DNA testing brought another form of evidence. The 2026 admission concerning Alice Eberhardt pushed the timeline back even further. Each stage changed the understanding of what had happened. And perhaps the final lesson is not about how many victims Richard Cottingham may have had. It is about how long the truth can remain hidden and how persistent the search for it can become. 40 years after his arrest, investigators were still uncovering information. More than 50 years after some of the murders, evidence was still producing answers. The past had not disappeared. It had remained in files, in preserved forensic material, in memories, and ultimately in the words of the man responsible for crimes that had devastated families across New York and New Jersey. Richard Cottingham will remain associated with one of the darkest serial murder investigations in the region's history. But the most important conclusion is not the legend surrounding the killer. It is the record of the victims whose names were recovered, the cases that were reopened, and the families who finally learned what had happened. Their stories should not be reduced to a number. They are the reason the investigation mattered. And they are the reason the search for truth continued long after the prison doors had closed behind Richard Cottingham. The story of Richard Cottingham is difficult to close because even after his arrest, conviction, and decades behind bars, the investigation continued to change. The man who was captured on May 22, 1980, was already known to investigators as a dangerous offender, but they did not yet understand the full history that would eventually emerge. At that moment, the police knew about the immediate crime at the Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights. They knew a woman had survived an attack. They knew Cottingham had been found with her. They would later connect him to murders that had already occurred. But they did not yet know that the investigation would eventually reach backward across more than a decade. From 1980 to 1965, and across numerous jurisdictions in New York and New Jersey. They could not have known that more than 40 years after his arrest, investigators would still be adding names to the record. The case therefore offers a rare perspective on what happens after a serial killer is caught. The arrest is often treated as the ending. In reality, for the families of the victims, it may be only the beginning of another search. The search for everything that happened before the arrest. Cottingham's known history demonstrates this painfully. The earliest case now connected to him is that of Alice Jean Eberhardt, an 18-year-old nursing student murdered in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, in 1965. Her case was reopened in 2021, and in January 2026, Cottingham confessed to the killing. That confession shifted the chronology of his known crimes. For years, 1967 had often been used as the earliest point in the history associated with him. Eberhardt's case moved that boundary back 2 years. It was not merely another entry on a timeline. It changed the understanding of how long Cottingham may have been killing. 2 years earlier than previously believed meant that the hidden history began when the man who would later become notorious as the Torso Killer was still far from public recognition as a serial offender. The same pattern can be seen in the case of Nancy Schiava-Vogel. She was 29 when she disappeared in Bergen County on October 28, 1967. She was a mother, reportedly on her way to play bingo at a church. Her body was later found in a car, and she had been strangled. For decades, her murder stood alone as an unsolved crime. Cottingham eventually accepted responsibility in 2010. That admission was important because it demonstrated that his known history extended beyond the murders for which he had originally been convicted. It opened a door into an earlier period, and investigators could then ask whether other unresolved cases from the same years might also have a connection. That question led to more names. Marion Della Sala was linked to Cottingham in the later investigation. Jacqueline Jackie Harp, only 13 years old, was another. Diane Cusick, 23, was another. Irene Blase and Denise Falaska were also connected to him. The dates were separated by months and years, but together they formed a pattern that had been invisible when each case was considered individually. The Cusick investigation was particularly significant because it showed that the past could be reopened through technology rather than confession alone. Cusick disappeared after leaving a dance class in December 1968 and visiting the area around Green Acres Mall in Valley Stream. Her case remained unresolved for more than 50 years. When Nassau County investigators revisited the evidence, modern DNA testing produced a match to Cottingham. In 2022, he pleaded guilty. That development illustrates the changing nature of forensic investigation. Evidence does not necessarily become useless merely because a case grows old. If evidence is preserved, future investigators may have tools unavailable to the original detectives. A cold case can therefore contain information that has not yet reached its full investigative potential. The same principle applies to the victims whose cases were resolved through later admissions. Lorraine Kelly and Marion Pryor disappeared in North Bergen on August 9, 1974. Kelly was 16. Pryor was 17. Their families had waited almost half a century before Cottingham admitted that he had abducted and killed them. In 2021, he pleaded guilty to their murders. For the families, the significance was not simply that a criminal had been punished. Cottingham had already been imprisoned for decades. The significance was that the unanswered questions surrounding the girl's disappearance finally had an answer. The same can be said of Rosalie Riceberg, whose 1975 Manhattan murder was connected to Cottingham through his confession in 2024. Her name had remained attached to an unresolved death for decades. The later admission placed responsibility where investigators believed it belonged and brought another case into the larger historical record. These developments reveal why the Cottingham case should not be measured only through the number of convictions. The legal process and the investigative process are related, but they are not identical. A conviction establishes criminal responsibility in court. A guilty plea establishes responsibility through the defendant's admission within a legal proceeding. A confession to investigators can provide crucial information, but it still has to be assessed alongside other evidence and the specific circumstances of the case. A DNA match can provide independent forensic evidence. These forms of proof do not all carry exactly the same meaning. The distinction is especially important because Cottingham made a much larger claim about his own crime. He said he had killed between 80 and 100 women. That number remains unverified. The investigative record provided here identifies 20 victims who had been established or linked to him by the beginning of 2026. The responsible conclusion is therefore not that Cottingham definitely killed 80 or 100 women. It is that he claims such a number. While 20 victims had been identified or linked in the available investigative record, the difference matters. True crime can easily become distorted when an offender's own words are treated as unquestionable fact. The victims deserve better than that. They deserve a record based on evidence, not mythology. The nickname Torso Killer presents another danger. It can turn a human tragedy into a memorable label centered on the offender. The murders involving dismemberment were horrifying, particularly the 1979 killings of Dita Godarzi and Manhattan Jane Doe at the Travel and Motor Hotel near Times Square. Firefighters responding to smoke from room 417 discovered the bodies. Godarzi was eventually identified as a 22-year-old Iranian immigrant who worked as a sex worker. The second victim remained unidentified. Their heads and hands were never recovered. Cottingham later said he removed such parts to make identification more difficult. But even in discussing these facts, the focus should remain on the victims rather than the spectacle of the crime. Godarzi had a name. Jane Doe had a life, even though her name remains unknown. The absence of an identity does not mean the absence of value. In fact, the unresolved identity of Manhattan Jane Doe represents one of the most painful limitations of the case. A killer can be identified while a victim remains unnamed. That contradiction reminds us that solving a homicide does not necessarily resolve every question surrounding it. The same principle applies to Gaylor Alexander, whose remains were discovered in separate locations after her disappearance in 1977. Cottingham admitted killing and dismembering her, and the case was connected to him. But its legal status remained more complicated than the convictions that originally placed him in prison. The investigation, therefore, contains different degrees of certainty. Some facts are established. Some are supported by forensic evidence. Some come from Cottingham's own admissions. Some remain unresolved. That is not a weakness in the story. It is the reality of a decades-long investigation. Perhaps the most unsettling element is the contrast between Cottingham's outward life and the crimes attributed to him. He worked in a computer-related position for an insurance company. He had a wife and 3 children. He maintained an apparently ordinary existence while, according to the cases eventually linked to him, women and girls were being murdered across the same broad region. His earlier arrests for driving under the influence and theft, and the arrests in 1973 and 1974 involving allegations of robbery, unlawful imprisonment, and sexual assault provide context, but they do not by themselves explain the later murders. The complete pattern became visible only after decades of investigation. That is why hindsight must be handled carefully. Knowing the ending can make earlier clues seem obvious. At the time, they were fragments without the complete picture. Ultimately, the legacy of the Cottingham investigation is not the legend of a mysterious killer who escaped justice forever. He did not. He was arrested. He was convicted. He received extraordinarily long sentences and remained imprisoned. The more enduring story is what happened afterward. Investigators continued looking. Old files were reopened. Preserved evidence was examined again. DNA technology changed what could be proved. Interviews produced new information. Cottingham himself provided admissions that connected him to cases dating back decades. By 2026, the investigative record contained 20 victims linked or identified, while the possibility of additional cases remained uncertain. The final lesson is therefore one of persistence. Time does not automatically erase a crime. A case can remain dormant without becoming meaningless. For families who spent decades without answers, every new development could transform uncertainty into knowledge. It could provide a name, a confession, a forensic connection, or an explanation for a disappearance that had haunted them for years. Nothing could restore the lives that had been taken. Nothing could return the years lost to grief and unanswered questions. But truth has value even when it arrives late. Richard Cottingham's name may remain associated with one of the darkest murder investigations in the New York, New Jersey region. But the final measure of that investigation should not be the reputation of the killer. It should be the recovery of the victim stories. They were not numbers, not evidence, and not chapters in the life of a criminal. They were people whose lives existed before their deaths, and whose identities deserve to survive. Afterward, the investigation that began with a survivor's cry for help in a New Jersey hotel ultimately became a decades-long effort to restore those identities to the historical record. And as the 2026 confession concerning Alice Eberhard demonstrated, even after more than 40 years, the past could still reveal another truth. That is where the story leaves us, not with certainty about every crime Cottingham ever committed, and not with acceptance of every claim he made, but with a documented record of victims, evidence, convictions, confessions, and unanswered questions. In the end, responsible remembrance means knowing the difference between them. It means refusing to turn speculation into fact, refusing to let sensationalism overshadow the victims, and recognizing that justice can sometimes arrive slowly, imperfectly, and decades after the crime. For those who waited, however, even a late answer could still matter. And that may be the most important conclusion of the Richard Cottingham case. The passage of time can delay the truth, but it does not necessarily have the power to bury it forever.